I received a lot of comments over the last year and a half of sharing my experience of recovering from schizophrenia through metabolic therapies, kind of expressing, oftentimes very angrily, that what I am sharing is inherently dangerous or potentially harming members of the schizophrenia community or mental health community who may be taking in this content. And so in this video, I'm going to be addressing some of these perceived risks inherent in what I've been sharing over the last year and a half, and also share why I'm choosing and why I'm deciding that it is more important to continue to share this experience. So maybe just a quick recap to start off with. Over the last year and a half, I've been trying to use ketogenic and metabolic therapies to see what effect it could have on my schizoaffective disorder. And it had kind of an astoundingly positive impact on my experience of my illness and my life. And I've been sharing this whole journey on this YouTube channel over the last year and a half, but essentially I am symptom-free, and I've been off psychiatric medications since September of 2024. This is an outcome I never really anticipated because I have been struggling with my mental illness and taking psychiatric medications for almost 15 years. And it has been something that I have struggled quite deeply with. I've been hospitalized numerous times for my illness. It has impacted my ability to work, relationships, so many elements of my life. And so going through this experience over the last year and a half is really something that I just feel should be shouted about from the rooftops as such a positive element of hope that I can offer other people who may be navigating similar challenges. But that is not everybody's sentiment who is watching this experience. And we've been talking a lot about, the whole challenge to identity aspect of why there may be some difficult feelings come up of watching this process of mine. But I think in this video, I really want to stick more to addressing what people are bringing up as inherent risks or dangerous elements of sharing this journey of recovery over the last year and a half that I have gone through personally. So maybe just to start it off with a big kind of overarching difference in perspective, perhaps, that I have from people who think that this is dangerous. And this is around something that comes up a lot in comments, usually from people who do not live with a schizophrenia spectrum illness, kind of saying or claiming that many people who live with a diagnosis like a schizophrenia spectrum illness just do not have the capacity to understand or to implement this in the way that I have. And honestly, this sentiment is something that I struggled with even before trying ketogenic and metabolic therapies. I have never felt that it is okay or fair or appropriate to judge someone else's capacity, without even knowing them, without knowing their circumstances, and just making this kind of blanket assumption about what someone living with a certain illness is capable of. I don't think that it is really ever appropriate or ethical to keep information from someone that could benefit them just because you have made this blanket assumption that they just don't have the capacity to take it in or to understand it. It kind of ends up being prejudice against people who live with schizophrenia spectrum illnesses. And so maybe that helps to establish as kind of my overarching perspective here that I just think that everybody deserves the information and deserves to know what's possible. Now that said, I do know that there is a real variation in capacity amongst people who are navigating schizophrenia spectrum illnesses or mental illness in general. I understand that that is a reality. But again, I just don't feel that if someone doesn't have the capacity to adequately implement this at this time, that this information should just be kept from them. I do think it could still open a door to ask a support for help in navigating this, or to hopefully eventually access support from the medical system. And I really just think that increasing awareness and knowledge of what is possible can really only be of benefit. And now that said, I do also understand that we are currently in a place of understanding and awareness around interventions like metabolic therapies and ketogenic therapy, where there just might not be enough information for everybody to be able to execute on this perfectly or even to understand it perfectly. And so I do actually want to get a little bit deeper into some of these criticisms and what could be a potential risk, and kind of talking you through why I still think it's important to share. So one of the big risks that people bring up quite often is around my deprescribing journey and saying that showing my experience of tapering down and getting off of my psychiatric medications is ultimately going to influence or encourage people to take that in and think that they can just immediately go off of their medications as well. I understand this to a degree if we're looking at this from, the variations in capacity and ability to understand information perspective. But again, I just really think it's important to be able to be having open conversations about this as well. I make an effort in all of our videos that touch on medications or deprescribing or tapering to really encourage people to work closely with their care team if they're making any changes or adjustments to medications at all, and really understanding that this is all is a serious medical intervention and it's not something that you can just mess around with on your own. I understand deeply being someone with a past experience of sometimes having delusional trails around medication, and so I understand that there is a degree of risk there in terms of having these conversations with people who may potentially be struggling with similar kind of delusional thoughts or difficulties and challenges around medication. And I get that. But at the same time, I, again, just really feel that it's such an important conversation to be having, and that people ultimately deserve to have a nuanced and balanced, I hope, conversation about the various aspects of being on psychiatric medication. And, I talked about my own previous experience of having difficulties around medication and trying to get off my medication and sometimes just quitting cold turkey and it just not going well for me in the past, before implementing metabolic therapies. And so I think it is also important to acknowledge and understand that this is kind of something that a lot of people with this type of illness struggle with and do, going off medication, regardless of what I've been sharing over the last year and a half. And so I think it's important to bring more nuanced discussion to this element of navigating the illness where, people generally don't really want to be on these medications. I didn't. And so the more we can talk about and explore how to potentially reduce it or go off in a safe way, I think the better. And again, that is not to make a blanket statement. I know there are people who are really happy with their medications, and that's great. But this is more addressing the criticism of people saying that, well, people are going to watch my content and just go off their medication. First of all, that is not what I've been recommending or talking about or saying on this channel. And second of all, I think it's an important conversation to be having. And then another risk that maybe I have more identified myself around sharing this process is around perhaps having a degree of medical oversimplification or missing components of this all. I've been sharing a lot over the last year and a half. And, from my perspective, it seems like a very comprehensive, overview of everything I've done, because obviously I know everything that is in every one of our videos, but I understand that probably a very, very small amount of people watch all our videos, if any at all. And so if you're only getting fragments of the story and just bits of this experience, perhaps that is a little bit of a risk in terms of if you are wanting to do it yourself and only having bits of how I've done it or bits of the information that really needs to be understood. This is an intensive medical intervention that, is a part of kind of every bit of my day and weeks and months and this year and a half. And it's ultimately impossible to share every little element of that. And so I do worry a little bit that maybe there isn't enough information in our channel, but perhaps that's why we're maybe focusing more on the empowerment piece and encouraging people to get curious and to figure out for themselves, and hopefully with some specialists or a care team, what is ultimately going to help them the most, each individual the most, and what is ultimately going to improve your quality of life. And maybe that includes doing a deep dive of our content and the content that we recommend and trying those things, but, not trying to create this blueprint for people, but more sparking an element of empowerment, I guess, to figure it out for themselves too. And then something that kind of maybe borders on a risk or a danger is kind of this idea that gets brought forward a lot about how ketogenic therapy doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And maybe the risk or the danger inherent in there is kind of resulting in feeling alienated or feeling shame or if it doesn't end up working for you. Maybe just to kind of validate that a little bit, like, yeah, it's hard to get information to do this properly. I've shared before that I tried in 2020 to use ketogenic therapy, and I did very, very wrong without even knowing. That felt really discouraging because it didn't really improve my mental health all that much. It wasn't until I got connected with specialists and really committed to like doing a deep dive exploration of how to make this work for myself this past year and a half that it had such profound effects. I know that it can feel really discouraging if you give it a go and it just doesn't have great effects or much impact at all. But something else to kind of understand here as well, or maybe bring more awareness to, is that oftentimes when I've spoken with people who haven't had success with using ketogenic therapy and gotten into kind of looking at what their approach was, there's oftentimes areas where they maybe weren't doing it properly as a medical intervention. And there is room to kind of troubleshoot like that and try again, and oftentimes with success. And now I want to be like careful not to put too much of that onus on the individual in terms of, well, you did it wrong, because that doesn't feel great, especially considering there's just not a lot of information about how to properly do it. And oftentimes care teams can't provide much guidance around how to implement it as a medical intervention. So I understand that is so hard, but I hope that in that process, you can kind of hang on to this idea that you are exploring how to improve your own quality of life, exploring different metabolic therapies, trying to make tweaks and adjustments that are ultimately going to help you improve your quality of life. And then another potential risk that I've been a little bit worried about is the potential this has to kind of undermine clinical trust, or to perhaps undermine the patient-clinician relationship. I know that there are a lot of doctors or clinicians who are skeptical or may not be on board with ketogenic therapy in the treatment of mental illness. And I know that that can provide a bit of a wedge between this clinician and the patient who is curious about it or wanting guidance on it, or was just asking the opinion. I myself have grappled to a degree with a bit of an eroding sense of trust in clinicians and the mental health care system. And I've heard from other people who are experiencing something similar. And also wanting to balance that with a respect for the system and the clinicians within it, who I think and I hope really are just trying to do as best they can by their patients. And it's this tricky kind of line to toe of wanting to work collaboratively with clinicians and the care system and wanting to ultimately bring it forward and push it forward and improve it kind of for everyone, but especially for patients, with this feeling of kind of having been let down by it a little bit. And I think where I'm kind of landing and where we've been really trying to explore on this channel as well is around the idea of feeling more empowered in leading your own care. And that doesn't mean telling your doctor or your care team what to do, but it means more having more confidence to share what your goals are, what you're wanting to explore, and working collaboratively with your care team, hopefully with a degree of openness and collaboration to hopefully come together on the goal of improving your quality of life. I know many doctors and clinicians are inherently scientifically minded, and so are really also wanting concrete, scientific evidence, studies, clinical trials, etc., to really be able to confidently make this decision to explore this as a treatment modality. And I get that that has been a bit of a barrier too, but there is so much science and research underway around this. And what ultimately leads to these more concrete scientific studies and whatnot are kind of the anecdotal case studies and sharing of these kinds of experiences. And so I think that's another element of why I feel it's really important for me to be sharing this whole experience in an effort to hopefully encourage science and the medical community to explore this more thoroughly. And that kind of leads to another criticism, but could also be a risk around, well, not everyone has the means or access to explore something like this at this time. And totally. And that is kind of an inherent risk, that there's not a lot of supports available to people to help them explore metabolic and ketogenic therapies and to navigate it. And I get that I am sharing this all from quite a privileged place. But my hope, again, is that by sharing this anecdotal experience and pushing science to explore this more, or encouraging it to explore this more, hopefully there could eventually be more mass uptake and adoption within medical systems, so that hopefully that does increase accessibility to more people as well. It's been a little bit of an interesting arc as a mental health advocate, as a schizophrenia advocate over the last 10 years or so, where when I was first diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, I felt a lot of stigma around that diagnosis and what it meant for my life and how I could engage kind of in society. And there was a lot of work, I put in a lot of work, and I know a lot of other advocates and whatnot put in a lot of work to increase awareness and understanding and to build empathy for conditions like schizophrenia spectrum illnesses. But there was still maybe a lot of pushback around that and, skepticism and still essentially stigma. And I think we've come to a place where there is a lot more, awareness around mental illness. But now it almost feels like it has really become kind of conflated with identity. And, we've talked about this a lot, but now I'm almost feeling stigma for proposing that it doesn't need to be such a rigid piece of identity and that recovery can be possible. And, I'm being met with kind of stigmatized narratives of that I am being dangerous or reckless or putting the community at risk by sharing my experience of recovery. I'm reading a book right now with a line that really struck me, and it was that ideas have to cause problems before they cause solutions. And I that felt really true in terms of trying to bring forward kind of a paradigm shift in how we understand things, in this case, chronic mental illness. And I don't mean that bringing forward this idea that recovery is possible, in my case, through ketogenic and metabolic therapies, needs to cause problems in the sense of endangering people. But I think I mean it causing a problem more in terms of us kind of collectively having to process that as a possibility and what that could mean for where we've kind of come to understand what it means to live with an illness like schizoaffective disorder or a schizophrenia spectrum illness or chronic mental illness. And so where I kind of keep landing around this is that, for every risk that could be potentially brought about from my sharing this experience of recovery, it also brings with it, I think, an even greater importance in sharing and a need for more honest conversations about what this means collectively as a mental health community and what could be possible. So I guess to wrap this up, I hear you on what some perceived risks or dangers could be in me sharing this. And I'm going to keep trying to do everything within my power to provide disclaimers and to try really to have as balanced and open and honest conversations about all of these elements as possible. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for following along on this journey. And thank you for being open to reflecting on, reconsidering, and growing what our understanding of these sorts of things are. As always, wishing you and your loved ones good health, and we'll see you in the next video.